Hello, this is John Seidel, the director of the Salisbury Hawk Southeast Asia Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science, the LSE. Welcome to Dialogues on Southeast Asia. Drawing on a wide range of research undertaken by experts on Southeast Asia, this podcast aims to provide specialist expertise and an interdisciplinary approach to the understanding of key issues and challenges across the region. Dialogues on Southeast Asia brings you discussions and debates with specialists in diverse disciplines and with different kinds of expertise on the countries of the region and on Southeast Asia as a whole. We hope you enjoy our podcast. Well, hello, everybody. My name is John Seidel. I'm the director of the Salisbury Hawk Southeast Asia Center here at the LSE. And on behalf of the center, I'm happy to welcome you all to today's event. And we're very delighted to welcome Nick Bisley from La Trobe University, who'll be speaking about re-globalization, geopolitics, and Southeast Asia. A few housekeeping points about today's seminar. The event is being recorded. For anyone attending via Zoom, please post your questions on the Q&A function. That's the Q&A function, not the chat. Please include your name, your affiliation, your location, and then your question. We'll put up an example of how to do this on the Q&A so you can model that. If you want to tweet about today's event, please do so using our tag at LSE SEAC for LSE Southeast Asia Center. And just to flag, coming ahead, we have a bunch of exciting events over the weeks ahead. We're not done for the year. And in particular, on Thursday, May 23rd, we have our sort of annual flagship event, Southeast Asia Forum. And this year, our theme is the challenges of sustainable growth in Southeast Asia. And we have a kind of star-studded cast of economists, Jomo Kwame Sundaram, who's affiliated now with the Khazanah Institute in Kuala Lumpur. We have Yulen Kaur, affiliated with the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. We have Vu-Ten Tuan, the Fulbright School of Public Policy and Management Dean and an economist based there. And we have Dr. Eve Warburton at the ANU, the Australian National University. So you can find information about that event and our other events upcoming over the weeks ahead and for next year soon enough on our website. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Nick Bisley, who is the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences and Professor of International Relations at La Trobe University in Australia. But for greater interest to us is that he's a prolific author on international relations. He's also a PhD of the LSE in International Relations. I should mention that. And he's the author of countless articles on international relations with a focus often on the Asia Pacific and from the perspective of Australia as well. And he has several books that he's authored, including The End of the Cold War and the Causes of Soviet Collapse, published in 2004 with Palgrave Macmillan, Great Powers in the Changing International Order with Lynn Reiner in 2011, and Rethinking Globalization, published by Bloomsbury in 2017. So many thanks for joining us today, Nick. We look forward to your talk.
Thanks, John. Your list of events there you were describing, I've got kind of event envy for your...
Keeps us busy.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And it's great to be back at the LSE. I was saying to John before, I was here at the height of New Labour, Blair's Britain. And LSE is a rather different place in many ways that I almost got lost wandering around. So it's great to be back and thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'm mostly my job at the moment is dealing with academic management and the delights of the neoliberal institution as it exists in the Australian context. Which I say this to my Vice Chancellor from time to time, which doesn't always go down well, but there you go. But it is a good opportunity. I really relish these opportunities to get back into the academic context and sort of present some of the ideas I'm working on. And this is part of a sort of larger book project that I'm about halfway-ish through, that's trying to make sense of the interplay of, essentially the interplay of globalization and geopolitics in contemporary Asia, and do a little bit of looking over the horizon to some degree. And it's when you get grey and wrinkly like me, you're able to do things your PhD students aren't allowed to do, which is to work, kind of do some speculating about the future. We've all probably had that discussion of, this all sounds very interesting, but you can't research the future in your PhD. But I'm doing a little bit of indulgence in looking, trying to look over the as I said, trying to look over the horizon. What I wanted to do here is sort of kind of road test some of the ideas I'm messing about with a focus in on Southeast Asia. So I'm very keen to sort of hear your thoughts about it from your perspective as people with particular interest in Southeast Asia. And in my remarks today, I want to do kind of three things. I want to sketch out a bit of a Southeast Asia version of the larger argument in the book around the creation of a kind of just Asia's long piece, but a more integrated, broader Asia region that's really created by a set of circumstances, but the center of it is globalization and the sort of market-led globalization that dominated up until, you know, February-ish 2020. And then look at how the foundations for Southeast Asia's sort of prosperity during that period of kind of Asia's long piece, just for just using that as a sort of shorthand, how that's eroding as geopolitics and the sort of dynamics of what I'm calling re-globalization, but that's very happy to, if people have got better, thoughtful, more what's the word, aesthetically pleasing ways of describing the attempts to remake globalization away from the kind of state, so market-led version that prevailed in the past to what's sort of being reconstituted in front of us, and then finish with some thoughts about what this all means for Southeast Asia's future as a kind of sub-region of the larger Asian system. I often remark both to students and others who are inflicted with my company and thoughts about these things that the term the Cold War in Asia and in Southeast Asia in particular is often, I think, as something of a cruel joke. Most of the Cold War was not especially cold, or it was particularly hot and particularly violent in many corners of the region, Southeast Asia, in its three Indochina wars, most obviously central amongst those, where, you know, the dynamics of decolonization collided with sort of great power politics, ideology and nationalism to create a particularly kind of potent social environment. But from the kind of late 1970s through until, you know, not too far in the past from where we are now, Southeast Asia was changed and transformed pretty significantly, and really as part of a pattern of relations that I think you can perceive across the Asian region as a whole, but it was particularly evident in Southeast Asia. That was meant that, you know, from the late 1970s through over several, you know, 3 to 4 decades from there, you know, Southeast Asia went from being a place that certainly was perceived by people in Australia, Japan, North Atlantic world as a place of endemic underdevelopment, of conflict and revolution. This place seemed to be stuck in a bit of a cycle of underdevelopment, if you want to call it that, just for shorthand. But that was transformed, and the argument I'm sort of putting forward in the book, or trying to explore in the book, is that it was transformed as part of that larger regional transformation by 3 big forces, one of which is globalization, sort of market-led globalization. One is the emergence of institutions, and one is geopolitics. So to take those in kind of reverse order, Sino-American normalization through the 1970s, you know, is the big shift, that you have this pretty dramatic change, diplomatically speaking, from a Washington and Beijing, which up until the late 1970s, you know, didn't recognize one another, couldn't get along, and were at great pains militarily and ideologically to contest one another. And fairly swiftly, relatively swiftly established a kind of grand bargain centered on that kind of really provided a sort of foundation stone on which the broader region's economic and social development could be facilitated. And that bargain was centered around, or what it produced was an environment in which there was a kind of great power amity. So the great powers no longer contested one another. They'd figured out how to get along. Didn't mean they were thrilled with the idea, and I certainly don't buy into the whole notion that, you know, America and China had established a very cordial set of relations, but they'd found a way to live with one another that they could both politically accept. There was an acceptance of American military predominance, primacy, hegemony. You know, don't have strong views on how you want to characterize it, but the United States was the dominant power geopolitically, if you want to stylize it as a balance of power. But it was accepted, and that was the key point, is that no significant player in the region was contesting American military predominance. And that then allowed for a very strong focus on domestic priorities across the region as a whole. If you take great power politics out of the equation, you take concerns about insecurity at the international level away, then if you're a South Korea, or if you're a Thailand, or if you're a Philippines, you can focus, you don't need to worry quite so much about international instability and spending money on defense military matters when you could be focused on domestic political, social, and economic reforms. And of course, the region had some real star performers in that. And of course, the region had some laggards in differing ways in which they could take advantage of that domestic focus. And broadly speaking, it promoted an environment of economic integration, broadly understood, not EU-style economic integration, but centered around globalization that was really driven by the acceptance of market-led globalization, particularly by the People's Republic of China. So that's the so number one is geopolitics. Number two is this emergence of market-led globalization, and particularly the way, and the focal point that I'm focused on in the book and the proposition putting forward today is that market-led globalization was critical, but at a macro level, but the real change that happened through the 80s and 90s was the move away from the business of doing international production, away from essentially building factories in other countries and selling, and you do that to get around tariff barriers, or you do that to take advantage of labor cost differences, but instead moving to complex supply chain production systems, so that firms went from being firms that made things in a foreign country, but largely in the same way they did before, to becoming managers of complex supply chains and managers of IP and branding. So you get the creation, and the classic sort of example of this is Apple and its iPhones and various other products, which, as we all know, if you look at the back of them, have a designed in California, assembled in China. And if you get under the hood, the thing is assembled in China, are made from all sorts of parts that are themselves assembled through complex supply chains that crisscross the region, both Southeast and Northeast Asia and other parts of the world, creating, for the first time, really an integrated Asian economy in which firms, particularly sort of small and mid-sized firms across Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, as well as large firms, can begin to take advantage and move rapidly up the sort of value chain through this sort of specialization. And this creates, as I said, by sort of February 2020, what I describe as a China-centered but not Sino-centric regional economy, that for the first time, and certainly in the modern period, you have a properly Asian economy with trade investment figures that look like they're real and not Southeast Asian firms competing with Northeast Asian firms for inbound FDI and outbound markets. And then the third sort of pillar of this transformed Southeast Asia are institutions. ASEAN began life as a way of managing post-colonial state building in Cold War Asia. It centered on intra-elite solidarity amongst authoritarian states. It was pretty effective at both that immediate task in the 1960s and then doing a sort of post-Cold War version of that as ASEAN firstly expanded to bring in the lesser developed Southeast Asian state members, and also expanded its remit outside of just the sort of traditional focal point of Southeast Asia to try to bring through ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus process, and a range of other ASEAN kind of plus ones and pluses to drive this agenda of, I think Evelyn Goes described it as sort of the omni-enmeshment of foreign policy, where ASEAN's essentially trying to shape the preferences and behaviors of the major powers outside Southeast Asia, because they know, in the 1990s and early 2000s, that how those major powers outside Southeast Asia relate to one another and relate to Southeast Asian states will be probably the most important thing shaping the geopolitical circumstances and economic circumstances of Southeast Asia. So there's a sort of good news story. So when people like me are writing their PhD and giving lectures in my first post-PhD job at the University of Reading, you're looking pretty optimistically out over the region in the early 2000s. And it's not that this is entirely trouble-free or that there's, the risks of conflict are gone, but there's a broadly optimistic, broadly liberal story that you can look forward over this period and see, particularly say in 2004, if you're wanting to see more democracy. There's lots of reasons why you think democracy is on the march, why you think that the ideas of and the opportunities of globalization seem to provide more upside than downside. And geopolitics looks like it's gone, potentially for good. The US and China have figured out how to get along. And certainly the US can't get its head around the idea why China would want to upset the apple cart in terms of both the geopolitical dispensation of the region and also focusing in on markets. So where we are now, of course, is much less optimistic. Those foundations, those sort of pillars, if you like, of the transformation of the region and that stable, broader environment have either gone or look pretty seriously weakened. Whether they're structurally, you don't want to push the metaphor around foundations and columns too hard, but there's these, if you sort of accept the basic premise that there's a kind of load-bearing component played by these things, in each of geopolitics, globalization, and institutions, we see some significant problems, either on the horizon or visible at this very moment. Most obviously, the China and the United States have no longer get along. There is no grand bargain that exists, and in fact, it's been replaced by explicit, clear-cut, although not particularly well managed, geopolitical contestation. The regional military balance has shifted, but also the configuration of interests in the region has changed. And one of the notable features of the sort of market-led globalization, particularly the early years of it, was a pretty neat alignment of interests economically and politically for support of American dominance. And what you have coming out of the sort of China-centered global economy is more and more countries that have pretty significant stake in China's economic growth and prosperity, even whilst they are uneasy about what that politically and geopolitically might mean for them. So Australia is a classic case of, China's our biggest trading partner, has been since 2007. It seems to grow every year in spite of everything else. And yet we are deeply uneasy about and uncertain about what this might mean. And you see across Southeast Asia, this pattern playing in different ways. Southeast Asian states don't manifest their anxiety quite as visibly as Australia does, but it's there nonetheless. The US and China clearly have incompatible visions for the region, incompatible both in the sense that their concept of the sort of preferred dispensation of Asia is very different from one another's, and their respective roles within it are very, very different. And as I said, I think that contestation between the two is unambiguous at the moment, and yet it lacks a degree of structure. It doesn't have the kind of rules of the game to manage it. You don't have the level of crisis management interaction. And notwithstanding the recent relatively positive meeting between Secretary Blinken and the Chinese leadership, this is still in its sort of infancy in terms of a managed geopolitical contestation. And indeed, I think at the moment, I think it isn't beyond the plausible to say that I think both sides find it very difficult to see the world from the other's perspective. That there is a sense, I think there is genuinely a sense within certainly the American policy elite that I talk to of bewilderment and almost betrayal that China doesn't realize what it's doing. Why can it not see that it's in its interest to forever accept a subordinate position in the region? And there's a genuine, why are they doing this? It's not in their interest to do this. And equally in PRC leadership, genuinely think, that sort of the anxiety-induced sensibility that, the United States is out to get them, so to speak, that the United States will not ever let the PRC achieve its potential, and that every thing that they are doing is viewed through this sense of, every sort of act of America's undertaking is viewed in this almost paranoid, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there is a sense that neither side can quite see and understand the strategic motivation for the other. And that makes, I think, it sort of exacerbates their relations and also makes the management of it much more complex. The second big problem, or not big problem, and the thing that at the moment I find both fascinating, disconcerting, but also very hard intellectually to do, is try to make sense of how globalization is being remade. So I think the argument I'm trying to explore in the book is you have this market-led globalization that prevails through until the start of the pandemic, in which, whilst geopolitical contestation and insecurity is bubbling around the sides of it, South China Sea disputes, classic example that begins to come back as a significant issue in the region, in the 2010s, 2012s, good 10 years, so good 8 years before COVID appears. And yet, as long as market-led globalization is in the predominant position, most people think that is, and the shared economic interest that the US and China have is always going to act as a kind of guardrail, that things are never going to get really, really bad because, to put it simply, it's in everyone's economic interest to ensure that the worst scenarios are avoided, and the classic liberal thinking that, corporate elites would get in the ears of the Americans and the Chinese to say, hey, pull back because we are going to, it's not in our interest as an Apple or as a Ford or as Huawei to have this geopolitical sentiment kind of let rip. And what happens, I think, with the COVID years is, I think, as a result of a series of separate but related developments, has now created a very different version of globalization that is being reconstructed, and it feels like kind of by the day, that you almost feel like every day you read a new story about a different set of legislative moves, tax subsidies, incentives, corporate plans from different countries around the region that are trying to put, and in fact not just trying, but are overtly and in some cases quite successfully putting a strategic, political, or economically nationalist frame around economic relations, so that where before 2020, basically firm decisions, profit maximization, price signals were the determinant of who made what, who sold what to whom. And whilst people were broadly aware of the vulnerabilities, and you have people who are supply chain managers, they could tell you before COVID that international supply chains are very finely balanced and that little things can have big ripple effects. And there's a lot of vulnerability about being, dependent on one country to manufacture an enormous amount of sort of day-to-day goods or medical supplies or whatever it might be. But we seemed on balance to be happy with that. We may not even have thought about it from a public policy point of view, or where, and I know certainly in the Australian context, people did look at this stuff and think about it and go, the balance of probabilities of something happening, that meant that the fact we depended so much on the PRC to produce PPE or particular pharmaceuticals was something that the risks of something happening that would block that off were so remote that we're like, that's balance of probabilities. We're happy to live with that. And what the COVID years do is really kind of three big things. Brings geopolitics to the surface. It's been there before, but all of a sudden across those years, geopolitics moves from a sort of not a marginal concern, but something that's of growing significance to being something that is of very significant political salience across the Asian region. The second thing you have is a COVID-inspired shift in essentially risk appetites from public policy figures across the region and indeed across the world, where states are no longer content to live with not having sovereign capability, or however you describe it, in a number of critical areas. Now, some of those areas are critical in medical, public health areas. Others are critical in the critical technologies, microchips being probably the most significant. But you see a number of other things emerging. So shipbuilding. So shipbuilding has suddenly become a critical sovereign capability that countries like Australia, United States, and others think that they need to improve their ability to deliver on, because market-led globalization meant that essentially their shipbuilding industries collapsed because we're content to live with offshoring them to, China, South Korea, Japan. And so those various forces of now, that political doubt about the reliability and importance of globalization has meant that voices that were marginal, so people have been saying these things, that we shouldn't be so dependent on the market, but you could never get any traction. You couldn't be taken seriously as a political figure if you stood up and said, we need to bring back shipbuilding, or we need to be able to do certain kinds of things ourselves. But people have been saying this, and the left in Australia, again, is an example, has long been arguing for industrial policy, but could not get, if you advocated for industrial policy prior to February 2020 in Australia, you could not be taken seriously at all. Whereas where we are now is, this is now not just serious political mainstream political figures, economic figures are saying this is an important and smart thing to do. And then related to that is the resurgence or return of kind of economic nationalism, where made in country X, insert country here, is seen as an important thing. Now, that might be about politically trying to rebuild a middle class. Jake Sullivan's American Foreign Policy for the Middle Class is a classic of the genre, and something which I always felt like when Sullivan and various others were rolling around the region saying American foreign policy will be designed to serve the American middle class, why everyone in the region can go, this isn't so good for us, because this is about your interests, the particular set of domestic economic interests prevailing over what had been before. And so these three things together are creating a pretty dynamic environment in which market-led globalization, I think, is clearly gone, or it's clearly not gone for good, but it's certainly moved significantly down the political salience, and state initiatives and state intervention and state subsidies and support are, in the language of sort of liberal economics, distorting market forces. And where we are now is really trying to figure out where that's going to land and what balance between the old market-led and the new sort of state-led economic globalization, where that's going to land. And I'm not someone who thinks, there's a version of this that says we end up with potentially Cold War 2.0 with proper blocks, Comic-Con style economic block here and a US-centered economic block here, and the two have very little to do with one another except for periodic exchanges of food or whatever it might be. I think that's very unlikely, although in my more pessimistic moments you sort of think, well, you can see a world in which that happens. There's a version that has, at the sort of more don't underestimate the power of firms to pursue profit and to have that prevail, that says maybe we'll probably get a bit of a snap back to where we were before. It might take a few years, but most firms mostly produce non-controversial things, and that if we can get the policy settings right, we can wall off certain sectors. The metaphor du jour is the idea of small gardens with high walls. Certain sectors are very sensitive and important, whether they be for security reasons or just we should be able to manufacture pharmaceuticals ourselves. That will be state-led, regulated, and controlled, but everything else will go back to largely where we were before. Or more likely, there'll be some messy, middle ground between those two things. And that's the bit that I'm trying to figure out, how to think about that. And then, because where that lands, if you think of it as a spectrum from very heavy state intervention to, some state intervention in some areas, but not much, markets largely working as they were before. I think depending on where that lands will have significant consequences for how the region's economy works, and in turn, how that intersects with the dynamics of geopolitical competition. And then, of course, I think in Southeast Asia in particular, you have seen significant institutional ossification. So ASEAN, for a whole bunch of reasons, I'll just quickly skip through, is, I think, not the institution that it once was. And I have very serious doubts about it ever being the kind of institution that it once was or hopes to still be over the coming decades. ASEAN and its offshoots have found managing great power competition, managing COVID, very difficult. ASEAN's, and in fact, and to be fair, ASEAN is in the same bracket as lots of international institutions that have found interstate rivalry, the return of interstate rivalry and competition very difficult, that found driving cooperation very hard. And if you're a good multilateralist, COVID was not a good period of time. That it was pretty disconcerting how little international cooperation to cope with a public health crisis that should have been tailor-made for precisely the kind of technocratic cooperation that ostensibly was fueling the growth of multilateralism in the post-Second World War and particularly the post-Cold War period. Asia's institutions, particularly Southeast Asia's institutions, I think there's been a kind of oversupply of institutional structures and an under-delivery in things that those institutional structures can produce. And in Southeast Asia in particular, I think we've seen a decided how best to describe it? I think you have seen, a surprising lack of cooperation and coordination in defense and security matters, and a real lack of solidarity amongst the ASEAN member states. Now, I know there are good reasons why this is the case, but as great power competition increases in tempo and risk and cost, the sort of logic of collaboration and intra-elite solidarity, to call it as it sort of was in the Cold War, to be unable to do that in your defense and security realms is a pretty worrying set of circumstances. ASEAN and key institutions, I think, also suffer from a lack of leadership, both inside the organization, but also the key institutions that have been the driving force of ASEAN over decades, particularly Indonesia, but also the emerging significant powers of the Philippines and Vietnam. If those three aren't driving and can be depended on thinking about pushing ASEAN solidarity and cooperation, then that organization is going to really significantly struggle. There's a few other just little points I'd make. The institutional structures of the regions have been not a place in which great power competition is managed, but in fact have become a site in which great power competition is played out. So if your classic kind of neo-functional logic of having institutions is to drive functional collaboration, to damp down the abilities of the major powers to contest with one another, these institutional structures have signally failed to do that, and in fact have become the place where the arm wrestle is being played out from time to time, not in its entirety. And then what we also see in the region now, I think, as a result of this, is alongside what I'd describe as the kind of traditional cooperative and inclusive approach to institutions, so cooperative as a basic mode of operation and inclusive in terms of the way they see membership and participation in these organizations. Alongside those have emerged a new batch of very sort of enthusiastic institutions that are designed to compete. So they are competitive and they are exclusive in their memberships, thinking about things like the Quad and AUKUS and other such initiatives. So what does all this mean for Southeast Asia? So kind of deep breath, set the scene. Now get to the specifics of Southeast Asia. Now there's a bit of in the sort of regional discussion and analysis of these dynamics, you tend to see kind of three basic metaphors or images that are sketched out. One is Southeast Asia becomes forum for great power competition. So it's a very passive image that Southeast Asia is the place where the major powers fight. Another image is Southeast Asia is the front line. And, this is the idea that Southeast Asia has almost like not an iron curtain, but a kind of line where you've got the Chinese affiliated states on one side and the American affiliated states on the other side, and then some swing states in the middle, and there's this sort of chessboard dynamic. And then the third is a kind of throwback to the Cold War, that Southeast Asia is a sort of zone for proxy fights. So you'll have the US and China won't fight each other, but they'll have their proxies sort of duke it out in different forms. And I think these are useful both telling us about how people think about these things, but it's also, I think, a useful way at least of counterpointing what I think is actually going on. And what's going on is quite messy and quite and not surprisingly, because we're really in the early phases of the patterns that are at play. And this is why, I'm committing the sin that the PhD student never should. The reason you tell your students you shouldn't do this is because it's very hard to write about things that are moving as they go. The problems of presentism, as my old PhD supervisor would describe it, are very real. Things that seem important today, 6 months, 12 months, 3 years from now, actually are not that significant. So finding that perspective, particularly with the scale of some of the trends I'm trying to grapple with, is tricky. So what's happening? I'll just make a few observations about what we see operating so far. Probably the most obvious thing that a lot of Southeast Asian states are doing is trying to avoid a binary approach to great power competition and to the positioning of the region's future as a contest between good and evil, or autocracy and democracy, but to say we have interests with both of you, we have interests with lots of other states, and we need to be able to advance those interests, and we need to have the freedom of maneuver. Don't force our hands, don't make us choose. So and if you haven't read it, probably the most kind of well-articulated English language expression of this was a speech Lee Hsien-loong gave to Shangri-La dialogue a couple of years ago, I think it was the 2019 one, essentially, basically saying, don't make us choose, don't make us do this in public. We want to be able to manage this in our own time, in our own speed. You do see that that's one pretty common trend. The second thing that's happening is that some states are clearly tightening their links to one side or the other, even whilst and the Singaporeans are a good example of this, even whilst Lee Hsien Loong and others are saying, well, don't make us choose, there's a lot of pretty significant collaboration in the security side going on with the Americans, with the Australians and the British and others. The positioning of Singapore, Philippines and others is it's clear which direction they are heading in, even though they don't want to put their cards on the table in the way that Australia or Japan clearly has. There's no one would dispute where Australia and Japan is going, even though both Australia and Japan are countries that have significant economic ties to the PRC. In security terms, those states are on one side of this ledger, whereas most Southeast Asian states are publicly not putting that down, but are, I think, beginning to see movement in a few different directions. A third thing, which I guess is to slightly repeat the point I made earlier, and that's to say, we are seeing growing institutional marginalization of ASEAN, and that's partly intra-ASEAN problems, but it's also, one of the arguments that proponents or supporters of ASEAN would say is, it has really it matters less because of the specific cooperative things that it drives, and more because of its sort of normative power and its discourse power, and the fact that, the great powers feel like they have to come along and pay, not lip service, but have to, choreograph their moves in relation to ASEAN and its existence. And I think you're beginning to see that happen less and less. So that, to take as a basic example, the people, pro-ASEAN folks would say, but, the major powers all feel like they have to come to the East Asia Summit and the ARF meetings and participate in all of these things, even if they don't really, even if it doesn't ultimately change everything that they do. That the fact that they feel the need to go through all of this is an indication that we still matter. And I think you're beginning to see that happen less and less. There is some interesting kind of external arbitrage going on. So the old geopolitical logic was times of great power competition are great for swing states because you can play them off each side, you can get money coming in, you can, and that was, of course, one of the problems of global competition was, you could work patronage networks to fund your version of where your state wants to go and would be a driver of competition and conflict. But you are seeing a little bit of that. Can we harness great power competition to domestic political economic goals? Now, if you haven't read it, probably one of the most interesting, although I think one of the most optimistic assessments of Southeast Asia's sort of future in this environment is Tom Park's book, which I think he wrote whilst he was on sabbatical here, maybe. So Tom's, if you haven't met Tom, he's the
Asia Foundation.
Asia Foundation. What role is he? I can't remember. Pretty senior.
In Bangkok.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what role. A very senior guy in the Asia Foundation. But he's written this book that essentially says Southeast Asia's future is itself multipolar, and more importantly, because of its ability to have these cross-cutting links with powers that are, with China, with the US, with France, with Germany, with Australia, with, all these different parties will act as a kind of lattice work. I think he goes for a bamboo metaphor, but the idea is these sort of interlocking components will help offset geopolitical competition, and in fact, in his more optimistic moment, sort of says it will act as a kind of stabilizer and as a vanguard for how the region as a whole can operate. And I think that's one version, but I think, as I said, it's a fairly optimistic take on how things may play out. And ultimately, if you're looking a little further down the horizon to say, okay, not just how things are going to look in the next couple of years, but over generation to multi-generational time horizon, I think what my basic sort of the thing I'm trying to think through is that how Southeast Asia will look is going to be, I think, a function of three big things. Like what does the great power competition end up actually looking like? How militarized does it get? Is a new grand bargain possible? What sort of, where in that spectrum we land? And then, of course, where in the spectrum of how re-globalization is constituted. So if I was in my best kind of North American social scientist mode, I would have a 3x3 grid with little boxes that kind of stylize out how all those look. And that I may end up doing that sort of thing, kind of thing. My publisher would say you should do that because they'll like that, and it'll make sense. But it has a certain functional utility. But then cutting across all of that is, a set of pretty complex things that all states in Southeast Asia are going to be grappling with, to do with domestic priorities, but also things like inequality, climate change, energy transition, and demographic transformations. And so it's a pretty complex, multivariable puzzle. But ultimately, you kind of have a sense of there's a spectrum of possibilities about where Southeast Asia is going to go. As I said, there's an optimistic take, and Tom articulates it very well. And there is it looks entirely plausible. You wouldn't sit there and go, that's just fantasy. This is never going to happen. But there are a few factors I think he doesn't dial in so much, and I think we need to think through a little bit. One is, and I think wherever we land in the re-globalization process, economic growth is going to be lower than it has been before. It's just a question of how much lower it is. And what that means for much of Southeast Asia is the opportunities for economic development are going to be less than they were. The question is just how much less. If you're a good liberal and you're wanting to see the next economic liftoff, and everyone's eyes, but people who are looking at these things will look at Indonesia and say, this is the country that is primed for economic, rapid economic development of the model that we've seen previously in the region as a whole. It's sort of Japan, Korea model, that Indonesia is big enough, diverse enough, got the right demography. But if you have a world in which economic globalization doesn't exist like it did in the 70s and 80s, and more importantly in the 90s and early 2000s, but it's much more statist, much more nationalist, much more state regulated, then your opportunities for your SMEs in Indonesia, which are really going to be the things that drive that, are going to be much more limited. And that's equally true of parts of India, and it's equally true of other parts of the global south. A second point, I think, is there is a very real prospect of that needs to be thought through, and again, not to say this will happen, but needs to be thought through, that some of Southeast Asian states could be dragged into conflict, and dragged into the contest, and that contest could be itself looking at things, it could be just friction and difficulty, and you're going to have to spend more on defense and less on the kinds of domestic priorities that you might otherwise have, off into being dragged into war. And you can think that it's not too outlandish to sort of game out a scenario in which the Philippines finds itself in a shooting war with China. Again, I think it's pretty unlikely, but you wouldn't say it's a zero probability event. A third thing that I'm pretty confident is going to happen, and mea culpa to my ASEAN supporting friends, is I think as regional institutions are in a phase of institutional decay, the question is just how bad they get. We're in an ossified phase, but you could look at ASEAN in 10 or 15 years' time and see ASEAN playing a role that's not dissimilar to the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. So that's the well-recognized body in South Asia that meets regularly, it issues communiques, and it's the classic of the sort of zombie international institution genre. And then the final thing I guess I'd say, and then I'll shut up because I've spoken for longer than I'd intended to, is that the opportunities for collaboration on the very significant transnational challenges that we face in the region, both Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, of those income inequality, pollution, climate change, transnational disease, that really need, and if COVID taught us one thing, well, COVID taught us many things, but on the nature of the transnational nature of the sort of acute security challenges that we face that aren't, military, nuclear weapons, that sorts of things, they require careful, significant collaboration across states and societies. And that the trends that are in play right now are pulling us entirely in the opposite direction. And it is, to be honest, it's very difficult to look at these things and be optimistic about them. But then you can read Tom Park's book and feel a little bit more optimistic because he's a sunny fellow. But that book it's a good it's a useful thing to, particularly in your darker moments, is to read someone who looks at things and sees positive trends and focuses in on those. But I thought I'd want to just contrast my slightly more gloomy prognosis with one that's a little bit more optimistic. I will shut up and very keen to hear thoughts, reactions, responses, denunciations.
Many thanks, Nick, for a really interesting set of reflections on the region's past, present, and future, and also for giving us a taste of what sounds like a very ambitious and interesting book. Tom Parks did pass through London early in the year, just after his book came out, but we weren't able to grab him for anything more than lunch. So it's great that you've referenced that, and that maybe in future we could have a kind of dialogue going on these big questions for the region. But now let's open the floor to questions. I can see there are 3 in the chat, but let's see those of us in the room. We might begin here over there. Well, if you could introduce yourself and then your question.
Oh, fantastic. Ronan Lee, Leader Hume Fellow at Loughborough University. Thanks, Nick. I mean, fantastic to hear from you. You're completely right. It's
Stop there. Okay, we're done.
Very easy to make predictions about how the world will look in 50 years, but in politics, absolutely impossible to make predictions how the world will look in 2 weeks. I mean, that's a constant challenge. I know you love talking about Donald Trump, so let me ask you this question. You framed a lot of this up in terms of the challenge being that the US and China have incompatible visions for Southeast Asia. And that's, in my view, entirely correct under President Biden. But what about a world where you have a return of President Trump who really, you could argue, has no vision for US engagement in Southeast Asia, or for as a vision for very minimal engagement in Southeast Asia? Does that lead to very sudden, very quick Chinese hegemony in a way that maybe we are not expecting?
Yeah.
Do you want to answer each one individually or round it up?
What would you prefer?
But why don't you go with that? It's a pretty big question.
Yeah.
And then we can see with we have a couple more here.
Yep, perfect.
Go for it.
Look, I'll try to be quick just to make sure we get everyone opportunities to pitch in. But I think it's a really good observation that, and partly I think it comes from my instinct originally is that, there's more continuity than change between Biden and Trump, and that always annoys the Biden people. But that also speaks to the fact that the first Trump administration, though clumsy, clunky, and messy and careless, was actually pretty out of the fairly orthodox parameters of US policy. Trump 2.0, or however you want to style it, I think promises something much more different than we had in his first administration. The European Council on Foreign Relations did a neat analysis of the people who are sort of jostling for influence for Trump, and they kind of say there seems to be 3 main camps. There's the kind of orthodox people for whom if they win the order of the day, you'll see more continuity than change in the large sort of direction of US foreign policy. Then there's what do they call them? They come up with a nice phrase, but essentially neo-isolationists, and that's the pullback from commitments, the not a dollar more. That's a JD Vance view of the world. Not a dollar more for Ukraine. Israel's Israel's this funny kind of has this odd quality in all of that. But if you think about Southeast Asia, they could not care less. The US commitments there are costly and of zero benefit to the US as they think of it. So that were that cohort to have the president's ear, and assuming it's implemented with a degree of consistency, then you could see a pretty radical shift, not just in Southeast Asia, but in Northeast Asia as well. You see, and I mean, I know that in Australia and other places, people are thinking that through, what that might mean, because if you take it to its logical conclusion, it's pretty disconcerting if you've got a defense policy that's been predicated on American, kind of the orthodoxy of American foreign policy for 70 years. That's a big shift. And then the third is the group that's, what do they call them? Basically, America has to pick its fights and prioritize its theaters of. So if you take the long train of US policy, has been since this 1945 was to have primacy in Western Europe, or you need to see off hostile hegemonic power in Western Europe, the Middle East, and the Western Pacific, or in Asia, that's no longer feasible. Given the distribution of power in the world, and the US has to focus its efforts in the area of greatest priority, and that sort of school of thought is largely focused on saying Asia has to be our priority theater, and that we need to focus all our efforts on containing China, and it is very much framed in those terms. So if you get orthodoxy or the third policy, then I think actually the broad sort of American posture doesn't change too much. It's for that group in the middle prevails, and Trump himself, I think, has no particular interests. And what we saw in the first administration was, you did see a lot of intra-bureaucratic arm wrestling just for the direction of policy between not just the different branches, but literally for what Trump would say every day. So sorry, a bit long-winded, but I think that's the useful way to think about it.
Great. We have two more questions in the room, one in the back and then up front. So if you go ahead.
Me?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, my question was.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name is Victoria Jones. I'm an Academy Fellow at Chatham House. My question was about the point you made when you said that Southeast Asian countries might have concerns about deeper engagement with China, what that means politically for them. And then, so I'm wondering, could you talk more about what those concerns are? And then secondly, you mentioned that they would be less likely to voice that concern in a public way. And that was also something I noticed when I was in a conference a couple of weeks ago in Sweden, and there was a delegation from Singapore, and they were making that exact same point. And I think that's like an interesting dynamic that doesn't get talked about enough. So could you comment on those two aspects?
Yeah, the latter.
And let's
Okay,
throw in
good.
another
Yep,
question.
yep.
Jeremy Stickings, former LSE anthropologist, and worked for the British A programme for many years. I was interested in what you were saying about ASEAN. Your phrase was, it's not the institution it once was, and you're depicting it as a declining organisation. And in the blurb circulated in advance of the meeting, you credited the efficacy of ASEAN and its offshoots with ensuring Southeast Asia security from geopolitical wrangling. I'm not sure I recall this golden era of ASEAN. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, yes, I am that old. It was regarded as a pretty uninfluential organisation, and no one could name any of the leaders of that, obviously the national leaders, but no sort of ASEAN figures, and any list of ASEAN's achievements would have filled a very small postage stamp. Was there some sort of great surge in ASEAN around 2000 or something, which is now declining from, or I'm not sure I quite recognise this.
Yeah, that's a good point, because so I'll come back to that one, because I'll just take that because it is worth clarifying that. On the public diplomacy side of things, it's interesting that the Southeast Asian states really clearly want to go back almost to the kind of pre-digital era, where elite positioning in policy is kind of hidden from public view, not for sort of anti-democratic sentiments, but just because it gives you more room to move. And I think the message, and I know this is happening, the message from countries in the region to the US in particular is, please don't talk about this in democracy or autocracy terms. Please don't ask us to go in public with semaphore. We don't want megaphone diplomacy or semaphore diplomacy. We need to be able to manage this very carefully, and not just for good old traditional, cultural reasons in Southeast Asia. That's also just a moray of diplomacy that ASEAN actually harnessed to good effect. But it makes the business of making tricky deals and learning how to play both sides of the street a bit easier. On the unease with the PRC, I think it's hard to generalize, because it depends particularly on each state and how they conceive both their economic interests and the trade-offs they have to make. So it's tricky to generalize. But probably the way it's normally stylized is, the lesser developed states tend to be more relaxed about, or even enthusiastic about, a greater Chinese influence, and largely just because it gives the prospects of them receiving the sorts of support, economic, political, those sorts of things, greater than previously. But there's sort of some complex ones as well, and I think Vietnam's a really interesting one to look at, because at a first glance you kind of go, Vietnam's been trending towards the United States. It's it's on the in the global risk board game. It's in the US column. It's been doing all of this, and it's got its dispute with China, and it sees the US as advancing its interests. Economically, it's done very well out of the old economic globalization. It's clearly in competition with plenty of parts of the Chinese economy in that, the offshoring style, and it's a country that would look at a more nationalist or statist version of globalization with some degree of concern. And yet, it's a pretty complex picture, because they're also the party elites, to the extent to which you'll ever get them to talk about it, and they're very they play their cards extraordinarily close to their chest, and the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam folks, who are very, very shrewd and very carefully, not stage managed, but you're sitting there going, come on, what do you really think? And they won't tell you. And they're certainly the Vietnamese elites at the moment are very uneasy, not just with the nature of the competition and the sort of standard we don't have to choose, but they're uneasy with both visions. They're not entirely content with American primacy forever. They certainly don't want to be caught up in a PRC hegemony, and finding a way of navigating that's really, really tricky for them. And I think that it's a bit like you were saying, Ronan. It's sort of you can see some short-term things, but seeing where they position themselves out in the medium, longer term is quite difficult. And so I think when you're looking at regional states and how they position themselves, you really do need to kind of dig right down into the details of the domestic interests and try to understand how they interplay, and even like elite groups, the SME owners, and how do they relate to the party elites, and how are they, and whether they're going to be rent seeking and those kinds of things. And to pay tribute to the work that you all do here is, you've got to get under the hood, and you need your anthropologists and your area studies people and the people who can speak these languages alongside people like me who try to make sense of the differing threads, because there is a temptation to paint a broad brushstroke that actually won't tell you a lot when you're trying to make sense of all of this. And that's why I without wanting to sound a bit too trite, when you sort of see where this is going, the messy, horrible, sort of mushy compromises is where this is going to be. But precisely where they play out, I think is very hard to discern. And actually, like I said, in those very closed societies, particularly where the political elites operate in a tightly controlled black box environment, it is quite hard to discern, which is a useful segue to ASEAN. And I mean, I've been glared at by Tommy Koh in my comments about ASEAN at meetings in Singapore. So I'm not an ASEAN hagiography kind of guy. But I think there were a couple of things that ASEAN did very well. And I think ASEAN did work in the Cold War period very effectively in an intra-elite solidarity manner that was not, I think the mistake is to go, did it work like the EU or some sort of traditionally liberal institution? No, it was never that. So there's a sort of phase where it's very effective in that mode of operation. And then there's the 90s period, really from the creation of the what we call the offshoots, for want of a better phrase, and then the expansion, where it again kind of commands, what would you call it? The center stage. They like that. I mean, I don't like the driver's seat metaphor, but they really do command the center stage at a period that's conducive to institutional operations. So US, you're post-Cold War, you're in a genuinely sort of liberal moment internationally, and they're pretty effective at setting the stage. What they don't do is deliver on it. And so I think yeah, so I think a bit glib to say there was a golden age, and there's a stylistic convenience in doing that, but it's and you're right. You have to be a pretty serious policy wonk to be able to name your secretaries general of ASEAN.
Let's take a look and see what we have online in terms of questions. I can see there's maybe one in the Q&A. Yes, Jürgen Hake.
Jürgen. Hey, Jürgen.
From the Department of International Relations here at the LSE. Good to see you, Nick. Could you please expand on Australia's ties with Southeast Asia and ASEAN? Is it fair to say that alliance considerations are these days the strongest influence on Australia's decisions vis-a-vis the region? If yes, how is this playing out? If not, what is? Also, how has Southeast Asia benefited from the Quad and trilateral dialogues of which Australia is a member? Finally, where do you see the FPDA going? Thanks. So that's quite a lot, but let's see, there's, what do we also have in the chat? Because we have two more questions because the time is running out.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Oliver Fall, Edelman Global Advisory in London. To what degree do you assess that despite its security promises, the US is seen as an unreliable strategic partner in Southeast Asia, given both the polarization of American administrations and a reluctance to grant preferential trade market access opportunities? And then Eric White, independent scholar in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in the US. How significant is or will be the civil war in Myanmar in fracturing the institutional capacity of ASEAN to deal with these larger challenges, particularly if the civil war intensifies but remains unresolved? So these are easy questions, which I'm sure you can address in
I think
time.
In some ways, in some ways, the last one's fairly straightforward. I think it's sort of yet another very significant example of the challenges ASEAN faces, that it's absolutely frozen in the headlights, so to speak, with Myanmar, and the worse that gets, the worse impact I think that will have for the institution. Let's see, the reliability of the United States. Interesting question, because it's, in some ways, it's, so if you have an alliance, you've got the classic alliance dilemma, and that hasn't gone away. There's always the risk that you get caught up in fights you could have avoided, or the big guy doesn't show up when you need him most, and you're most dependent on your defense for having him being there. The sense, I think, is that, in certainly my analysis and discussions with Southeast Asian policy elites on this question, is that I think on the narrow understanding of the alliance, and states that have a security kind of guarantee-ish set of relationships with the US, think that, if anything, the current period, and this is Biden, so I think we bracket that out, have to wait and see what happens with Trump, is that if anything, the prospects of reliability have gone up. So if you're Philippines now thinking, if things go south, and and it's always like, it would depend on exactly what happened and what the circumstances were, but under the right set of circumstances, I think your prospects of the US not coming to your aid and support, I think, are probably lower than they were a few years ago. But the bigger point, I think, that the question gets at, although it's separate, is that the mood around trade in the US, particularly the politics of trade in the US, really significantly hampers America's ambitions in Asia, and in Southeast Asia in particular. So that if you ask any, not just SME, but if you ask, Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials from just about every, probably not the really developing economies, but from just about every Southeast Asian state, and indeed probably pretty much across the board in the region as a whole, what they would like from the Americans, immediately, if the fairy godmother dropped out of the sky and gave them 3 wishes, it would be better access to American markets, trade agreements of one form or another. And the fact that the US cannot provide that because it's essentially because of its political toxicity in the United States, really hampers what America is doing. And you can see in the pretty weak beer of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, as it's lovingly known, and how, frankly, unimpressive and minuscule it is in terms of the economic benefits it provides. And when you contrast that with a PRC that's very adept and frankly pretty cynical at being able to go, hey, here's some money for your infrastructure project or for whatever it is that you need, and we can arrange some sorts of sort of economic benefits in a way that the United States either won't do in terms of just straight up aid programs of those kinds, or in terms of market access, is really, I think, hindering the United States, and it will hinder regardless of who wins, because that issue is just so clearly on the nose in the United States. And then to finish with Jürgen's many questions, shame I couldn't see you, Jürgen. I'll start with Australia and Southeast Asia, because
He's up there in the corner.
is he? Oh yeah, hey, how you doing? It's interesting because it is, you see for Canberra an interesting set of circumstances that have got some potentially broader generalization or broader observations or consequences for others. So one of the big trends in Australian foreign policy generally has been the way defence and security matters have kind of swallowed Australian foreign policy whole. And that's both the resources, but also the ideas and thinking about it. The current government, and under I think the very, very astute leadership of Penny Wong as Foreign Minister, they're beginning to sort of reclaim some space, but it's pretty small ultimately. And you see that challenge playing out in Southeast Asia. So that's, how do you as a country like Australia, with ultimately limited bandwidth in your foreign ministry, limited resources in terms of the sort of treasure, cash that you could throw at statecraft, defense, diplomacy, development stuff. And where we are finding, where the Australian government is finding it hardest to manage is in Southeast Asia, and matching a rhetoric of Southeast Asia is our most important zone of focus, that we want to prioritize both our bilateral ties with just about every Southeast Asian state and our ties with ASEAN, and turning that into substantive policy, when at the same time enormous amounts of time, energy, and effort is being poured into arrangements like Quad, and in particular AUKUS. The submarine program is no exaggeration to say that is consuming the Defence Department. It's consuming enormous amounts of time and energy in Canberra. So that means that when Australia does say, right, let's make this real with Southeast Asia, and there was an ASEAN special summit to mark the 50th anniversary of Australia ASEAN Dialogue Partnership in Melbourne, which was interestingly downplayed by the government in local press. So you almost wouldn't know it was happening, which was kind of curious for a whole range of reasons. But if I went to some of the bits that the Track 2 stuff and a few things that the academic civilians were allowed to go to, and you got a really neat encapsulation of the dilemma, which is the optics were great, speeches were great, and the substance was pretty thin. And I mean, there were a few programs, initiative, a few announceables. Half of some money was put on the table. Most of it was just the old repurposed money that was already committed, just given a different sticker. There was some new money. Lots of it was pretty low key, and ultimately you walked away from it saying this was, as a summit, as an optics event, very positive, but ultimately the priority of Canberra is so much on the management of the alliance, the big geopolitical security concerns, and the fact that the security agencies in Canberra continue to predominate. They have a very, how to put it, security focused and frankly very anxious, if not frightened, view of the region. That the region is a terribly dangerous place, and that China is a serious existential threat to our interests, and we need to spend a lot of time, money, and effort on traditional military statecraft. And that has meant that, notwithstanding, as I said, a rhetorical commitment to Southeast Asia and to ASEAN centrality and all these sorts of things, we do find it very difficult to turn that into substance. I don't have time on the FPDA, I'm afraid. I do have a PhD student working on this, so in the event that he gets to the end of it, we can give you some more details. But I think that the FPDA is potentially a little possibility where you could see a convergence between multilateral engagement, security concerns, and regional interests. So there's potentially, you could say that's something where you could but it's ultimately, it's pretty niche. It's in your ASEAN Secretary General handbook for niche interests, but I've probably exhausted everyone's time and patience at this point.
Well, you certainly haven't exhausted our patience, but we're running out of time. So thank you to everyone for participating, those of you patching in online, those of you here today in person. But above all, many thanks to Nick for giving us his very thoughtful and interesting presentation and preview of his forthcoming book, and for fielding questions so eloquently and engagingly and effectively. So many thanks.
Thank you.